Wait, are you saying there's a final fight full of CGI where the hero fights a bad guy who has similar powers? Yeah, I guess so. Now that is a Marvel third act. I love it.
Hey, what's up guys? It's Rick with the Digital Divide. Today we're going to be taking a look at Marvel's problem with villains in the MCU. I think that a lot of them are super underdeveloped and end up being a carbon copy of the main protagonist of the movie. And I think a lot of that has to do with what I refer to as the Superman effect. And what I mean by that is that when you introduce a hero and his abilities are so strong and seemingly impossible to defeat, it makes it really hard to come up with an antagonist or a villain that can match him. So as a result, a lot of MCU movies have just made their villains just basically a copy of the hero. And this dates all the way back to the very first Iron Man movie, where Iron Man was basically just fighting himself. So it's just Iron Man fighting Iron Man in a bigger suit, even though the antagonist in the film did not have the technology to build such a suit. Another example is a show that I loved called WandaVision, and even that fell victim to this, where Wanda was essentially fighting a copy of herself in that she was fighting another sorcerer with similar powers, and Vision was literally fighting a copy of himself. It was Vision versus White Vision with the same exact powers. The first Ant-Man had this same issue as well, where Ant-Man was fighting basically another copy of himself. It was a villain that had the exact same abilities. He could shrink himself, he had a little suit that could shrink himself, and it was just the same thing over and over again. One of the most egregious examples, I think, is Black Panther, where they really developed the character throughout the entire movie, but then in the last third act, it fell into the same trope that Marvel seems to always fall into in their third act, where it's a big CG fight scene where the villain and the hero are basically the same person with the same powers, and it kind of undoes all of the character development specifically in that movie that they accomplished, which I think was really, really impressive. Now, one of my favorite movies of all time is Logan, and even that movie, which was not developed by the MCU, fell victim to the same exact issue. And I love this movie still. I think it overcomes it, and I'll get into that later. But yeah, Logan is basically just fighting himself. I mean, literally just fighting himself. Not basically. He is literally fighting a copy of himself, devoid of any emotion. I think, though, that Logan gets away with it for a number of reasons. I think mainly it's because they mixed up the formula by giving this one an R rating, so they were free to introduce some unique elements that they weren't able to before. I think that this is because this is the end of Logan's story, the stakes were super elevated. And then lastly, Logan was in a weakened state. This was not a one-to-one threat. Like, he wasn't as powerful as the villain that was coming after him. Marvel seems to be continuing this trend, even with brand new movies like Shang-Chi, where the hero and the villain basically have the exact same powers that they are fighting over, and it's starting to get a little stale. And I really like Shang-Chi, but I was disappointed to see that they fell into the exact same routine that they do in most of their MCU character introductions. So why does this keep happening? I think that it keeps happening because they just don't have the time and the budget to properly develop the villains as they do the heroes. With the heroes, they really take their time, and I love that about Marvel in general. Typically, it starts with the MCU hero getting either a cameo appearance or a mention in an unrelated but important MCU movie, and that's followed up by that same MCU hero getting a starring role in their own movie. The villain, though, really typically isn't introduced until that movie, so the MCU hero's main antagonist is introduced and defeated in the very same movie, whereas the hero got, at least one subsequent movie and a cameo to help develop that character. So you care about the character while the bad guy is introduced and defeated, and they have one movie basically to flesh them out as a character, and that doesn't work. So Thanos was the exception to all of this. Thanos was an amazing villain, and the reason he worked out so as well as he did is because they spent multiple movies developing him. He was mentioned or shown in several MCU movies, such as the first Avengers movie, Guardians of the Galaxy, and his motivations were clear. His first main introduction into the MCU was literally him beating the living out of Hulk, which at that point in the MCU timeline was the most powerful Avenger that there was. So right out of the gate, the stakes are elevated to a point that is almost absurd, where he, without even breaking a sweat, just completely stomps Hulk. And that sets a precedent that, hey, this is not your normal MCU villain. This guy's a real threat. This guy is a top-tier threat. And it's not just that he's a powerhouse, but also that he really believes in what he's doing, and you know that throughout the subsequent movies before he makes his first huge appearance. Even the music that they play when they introduce him really sets a tone, and you can see the fear in everyone's eyes when he walks on screen. Everyone looks absolutely terrified of him.
Eyes up. Stay sharp.
So Thanos was an amazing villain, and I hope that Marvel continues the trend of trying to more thoroughly develop their villains instead of them being an afterthought. And I think they are starting to learn that that's important. And I think that the most recent example is the Eternals that just came out. That movie did not follow the same trend as most of the subsequent movies. Its main antagonist, which I'm not going to spoil here because the movie just came out, I won't get into detail, but that villain breaks the mold. It's not what you expect going into it. I think another great example is Loki. I think Loki did an amazing job. They had an entire season to build up the anticipation of who's pulling the strings in the background and who the main villain was and what that villain's motivations were. And despite what you may think about, the way that they presented Kang the Conqueror, you may like it, you may not. Regardless of your feelings on how he was portrayed in the show, I think they did a really excellent job of building up his character to be the next Thanos-level threat. And I hope that Marvel continues that trend. So I hope this video was fun for you guys. That's all I've got right now. As always, thank you for watching, and leave any comments below if you disagree or agree with me on this. Thank you.